On the luxurious flight, CEO James Wheeler, wearing an incredibly expensive Italian suit, looks disdainfully at Amira, a 15-year-old Arab teenager. "How dare you sit in first class?" he shouted, publicly humiliating her. Little does he know that the fate of this flight is in her hands, and his arrogance is about to cost him dearly. Terminal 4 of John F. Kennedy International Airport was buzzing with activity that autumn morning. Among the crowd of hurried travelers, one figure stood out for her serenity. Amira Khalil, a 15-year-old girl, walked calmly towards the boarding gate, her sky-blue hijab softly contrasting with her brown skin and bright brown eyes. Dressed in a well-pressed hijab and a long-sleeved blouse in a soft shade of beige, Amira carried only a backpack and a slim laptop under her arm. Her appearance was modest, but there was a natural elegance in her movements and a quiet confidence in her gaze. As she approached the check-in counter for the first-class flight from New York to Los Angeles, Amira noticed the curious glances from other passengers. Some observed her with a mix of surprise and interest, others with a barely disguised hint of distrust. The young woman, however, maintained her composure, accustomed to being the object of attention wherever she went. It was then that a loud, irritated voice cut through the air, making Amira instinctively turn. "This is ridiculous. How can they allow just anyone into first class? There are standards to be maintained." The man uttering these words in an exalted tone was James Wheeler, the 55-year-old CEO of a renowned technology company. Tall, broad-shouldered, with perfectly combed grey hair, Wheeler exuded an aura of authority and arrogance. His tailored Italian suit and branded leather briefcase screamed power and money to anyone who cared to look. Wheeler pointed indiscreetly at Amira as he continued his diatribe. "Look at her. She clearly doesn't belong here. She probably can't. I even speak English properly. How do they expect me to travel next to someone like that?" Amira felt the weight of the stares on her intensify. She took a deep breath, remembering her grandmother's words. True strength lies in calm in the face of the storm. With a tranquility that surprised even herself, she approached the counter and presented her boarding pass to the attendant, who quickly verified it. "Everything's in order, Miss Khalil," said the attendant with a gentle smile, casting a disapproving look in Wheeler's direction. "Your seat is 2A. Have a great flight." Wheeler, seeing that his complaints weren't having the desired effect, audibly huffed. "This is ridiculous. I'm going to file a formal complaint with the airline. Standards are falling alarmingly." Amira, ignoring the comments, headed towards the boarding bridge, her head held high and her steps firm. Wheeler's words hurt her, but she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her shaken. After all, it wasn't the first time she had faced prejudice, and she knew that, unfortunately, it wouldn't be the last. The luxurious interior of first class strongly contrasted with the tense atmosphere that settled as soon as passengers began to get comfortable. Amira found her seat quickly, storing her backpack in the overhead compartment and sitting down with her laptop on her lap. She could feel the glances of other passengers, some curious, others uncomfortable. James Wheeler entered the cabin as, if he owned the plane, his look of contempt immediately landing on Amira. To his evident irritation, his seat was right next to the young woman. He addressed the nearest flight attendant, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I demand a seat change immediately. I will not sit next to her," he said, pointing to Amira without any shame. The attendant, a middle-aged woman with a badge indicating years of experience, responded with professional firmness. "I'm sorry, Mr. Wheeler, but the flight is completely full. All seats have been assigned. I can assure you that Miss Khalil has every right to be here, just like you do." Wheeler, frustrated, threw himself into his seat, muttering something about declining standards and the end of civilization as we know it. Amira remained silent, focused on her laptop, her fingers skillfully gliding over the keyboard. It was then that an elderly lady seated across the aisle decided to intervene. With silver hair and an air of distinction, she leaned towards Wheeler. "Young man," she said, her voice firm despite her age, "your attitude is shameful. This girl has done nothing to deserve such treatment." Wheeler turned abruptly to the lady, his face red with anger. "With all due respect, ma'am, you don't understand. People like her are taking up spaces that don't belong to them. It's a matter of principle." The elderly lady was about to respond when Amira gently intervened. "Please, don't worry," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I'm used to this. It's not worth getting upset over." The calm and maturity in Amira's voice surprised everyone who heard it. Wheeler, momentarily speechless, turned his attention to his phone, making a call loudly, clearly intending to be heard. "Yeah, you won't believe what's happening here. First, class is full of, well, you know, people who clearly don't belong. It's absurd." As Wheeler continued his conversation filled with derogatory comments, the other passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. The tension in the air was palpable, and the flight had barely begun. As the flight progressed, the tension in first class seemed only to increase. James Wheeler had become the center of unwanted attention, his offensive comments echoing through the cabin at regular intervals. Amira, on the other hand, remained absorbed in her work, her fingers dancing over the laptop keyboard with impressive speed and precision. When the meal service began, Wheeler saw another opportunity to provoke. As the flight attendant served the carefully prepared dishes, he made a point of asking loudly, "I hope they're not serving any halal food here. It's bad enough having to share space with certain people." The flight attendant, visibly uncomfortable, responded professionally, "Sir, we offer a variety of options to meet all our passengers' dietary needs." Amira, who until then had ignored the provocations, looked up from her laptop. Her gaze met Wheeler's for a brief moment, and in it there was no anger or resentment, just a calmness that seemed to defy the executive's understanding. "Sir," she said softly, "you might be surprised to know that many of the foods you enjoy probably meet halal standards without you realizing it. Cuisine, like technology, knows no cultural boundaries." Amira's polite and articulate response caught Wheeler off guard. He opened his mouth to retort, but words failed him. Instead, his face contorted into an expression of barely disguised contempt. It was at this moment that an older executive, seated a few rows ahead, turned to observe the scene. His keen eyes noticed something on Amira's laptop that made him raise his eyebrows with interest. On the screen, lines of complex code were scrolling rapidly, a digital ballet that few could comprehend. Wheeler, frustrated by his inability to provoke a stronger reaction from Amira, decided to up his game. With a seemingly accidental movement, he knocked his water glass onto the young woman's laptop. "Oh, how clumsy of me," he said, a sarcastic smile on his lips. "I hope I didn't damage your little toy." Amira, with surprising calmness, quickly grabbed napkins and began drying the equipment. "Don't worry, sir, this little toy is more resilient than it looks, just like me." Amira's response, delivered without a drop of rancor but loaded with a dignity, caused a murmur of approval among the other passengers. Wheeler, realizing that his tactic had backfired, leaned back in his seat, his face a mask of irritation. The older executive, who had observed the entire scene, made a discreet note in his notebook. Something told him that this young woman was much more than she appeared, and he was determined to find out more. As the flight continued, the tension remained high, but now it was Wheeler who seemed uncomfortable, while Amira calmly returned to her work, the lines of code on her screen telling a story that no one there except her could fully comprehend. The flight continued without major incidents, the tension in first class having transformed into a loaded silence. Amira kept working on her laptop, seemingly oblivious to the discomfort around her, while James Wheeler alternated between casting looks of contempt at the young woman and talking quietly on his phone. It was then that, without warning, the plane entered an area of severe turbulence. The lights flickered and the fasten seatbelt sign lit up with an urgent ding. Passengers, caught by surprise, gripped their armrests. "Ladies and gentlemen," the pilot's voice sounded over the speakers, "we are encountering an area of unexpected turbulence. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened." As the plane shook, Wheeler, visibly disturbed, tried to maintain his composure. Amira, on the other hand, remained calm, her fingers still dancing over the keyboard, albeit more carefully now. Suddenly, the individual entertainment screens at each seat flickered and went dark. Murmurs of confusion spread through the cabin. "This is unacceptable," exclaimed Wheeler, hitting his dark screen in frustration. "I paid a fortune for this ticket, and even the entertainment system doesn't work." The turbulence began to subside, but the unease among the passengers increased. It was then that the pilot's voice sounded again, this time with a note of concern. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a technical problem with our onboard systems. There is no cause for alarm, but we would like to know if there are any systems experts among the passengers who could assist us." Wheeler immediately stood up, adjusting his tie. "I am James Wheeler, CEO of Tech Fusion. I'm sure I can help with any technical problem." A flight attendant quickly approached. "Thank you, Mr. Wheeler. Please follow me to the cockpit." As Wheeler followed the attendant, he cast a look of superiority at Amira, who remained focused on her work, seemingly oblivious to the situation. Minutes passed, and anxiety in the cabin grew. Passengers whispered among themselves, casting worried glances towards the front of the plane. Finally, Wheeler returned, but his countenance was not one of triumph. On the contrary, he looked frustrated and slightly embarrassed. "Apparently," he said aloud, trying to maintain a tone of authority, "the problem is more complex than we thought. Something related to a new security system. Unfortunately, I couldn't be of much help." It was at this moment that Amira finally looked up from her laptop. She looked around, observing the concerned faces of the other passengers, and then, with an almost inaudible sigh, raised her hand. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I think I can help." All eyes turned to her, including Wheeler's, who couldn't hide his incredulity. "You?" he scoffed. "What could a little girl like you do that I couldn't?" The flight attendant, ignoring Wheeler's comment, approached Amira. "Do you have experience with aviation systems, miss?" Amira nodded calmly. "Yes, I do. Actually, Before she could finish, the pilot appeared at the entrance to the first-class cabin, his face a mask of professional concern. "Miss Khalil?" he asked, his eyes fixed on Amira. "Is it really you?" The young woman smiled shyly. "Yes, it's me. I heard you're having trouble with the new security system. May I take a look?" The pilot looked relieved. "Please, come with me immediately." As Amira got up to follow the pilot, the other passengers exchanged confused looks. Wheeler, in particular, looked completely stunned. The older executive, who had noticed Amira's work on her laptop earlier, smiled to himself. He had a feeling they were about to witness something extraordinary. The flight continued, but the atmosphere in first class remained charged. James Wheeler, still unhappy with Amira's presence, couldn't contain his irritation. His eyes cast furtive glances at the young woman, who remained focused on her laptop, seemingly oblivious to the hostility around her. A flight attendant approached, offering drinks. "Would you like something to drink, miss?" she asked Amira kindly. Before the young woman could respond, Wheeler intervened sarcastically. "Maybe some camel juice or holy water from the desert." The flight attendant looked visibly uncomfortable, while some nearby passengers exchanged looks of disapproval. Amira, maintaining her composure, simply smiled and replied, "A mint tea, please, thank you." Wheeler snorted, muttering something about declining standards and undesirable clientele. His voice, though low, was perfectly audible to the surrounding passengers. An elderly lady seated across the aisle could no longer contain herself. With a firm voice, despite her advanced age, she addressed Wheeler. "Young man, your attitude is completely unacceptable. This girl has done nothing to deserve such treatment." Wheeler turned abruptly to the lady, his face red with anger. "With all due respect, ma'am, this is none of your business. I paid a fortune for this seat and have the right to express my opinion about who should or shouldn't be here." The tension in the air was palpable. Other passengers began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, torn between wanting to intervene and fear of making the situation worse. Amira, noticing the general discomfort, gently touched the elderly ladies. "Armaton, please don't worry about me. I'm fine, really. I appreciate your kindness." Amira's dignity and calmness contrasted drastically with Wheeler's aggressive posture, making it even more evident who really belonged in that environment. When the meal service began, the tension reached a new level. The flight attendants were distributing menus, detailing the options available for dinner. Wheeler, flipping through the menu with disdain, didn't miss the opportunity to make another derogatory comment. "I hope they haven't ruined all the food to cater to certain special dietary requirements," he said, casting a meaningful look at Amira. The young woman once again chose not to respond, keeping her attention on the laptop in front of her. Her silence, however, seemed to irritate Wheeler even more. When the flight attendant arrived to take orders, Wheeler made sure to be the first to speak. "I want the filet mignon, rare, and please, make sure it wasn't prepared according to any strange ritual." The flight attendant, visibly uncomfortable, nodded and turned to Amira. "And for you, miss, the vegetarian dish, please," Amira replied softly. Wheeler let out a scornful laugh. "Of course, because eating meat would be against your primitive beliefs, wouldn't it?" Some nearby passengers let out exclamations of indignation, but before anyone could intervene, the unexpected occurred. Wheeler, gesturing dramatically while speaking, knocked over his water glass. The liquid spread across the armrest and fell directly onto Amira's laptop. "Oh, how clumsy of me," said Wheeler with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "My sincere apologies." Amira quickly lifted the laptop, trying to save the equipment from the dripping liquid. Her face, for the first time, showed a shadow of concern. "Don't worry," she said, more to herself than to Wheeler, as she tried to dry the keyboard with napkins. A middle-aged executive seated in the row behind observed the scene with interest. His astute eyes noticed something on Amira's laptop screen. Before she closed it, complex lines of code that didn't seem like typical teenage work. The man frowned, his curiosity piqued. There was more to this young woman than met the eye, and he was determined to find out what. As Amira dealt with the consequences of the accident, the middle-aged executive, whose name was Robert Thornton, continued to observe her with growing interest. With over 30 years of experience in the technology sector, Robert instantly recognized the complexity of the code he had glimpsed on Amira's screen. "Fascinating," he muttered to himself, adjusting his glasses for a better view. Amira, oblivious to the attention she was receiving, continued to work on her laptop, which fortunately seemed to have survived the involuntary bath. Her fingers flew over the keyboard with a speed and precision that Robert found impressive. Meanwhile, Wheeler seemed pleased with himself. Leaning back in his seat with a satisfied smile, he cast another disdainful look at Amira before picking up a business magazine and beginning to flip through it ostentatiously. Robert, unable to contain his curiosity, leaned slightly forward. "Excuse me, miss," he said in a low voice, not wanting to attract Wheeler's attention. "I couldn't help but notice what you were doing. That code, is it for an aviation security system?" Amira turned, surprised by the question. She hesitated for a moment before responding with a shy smile. Yes, it is. I'm making some final adjustments to a new security protocol. Robert nodded, impressed. Interesting. It's not something you see every day, especially... He stopped, aware that he was about to comment on her age. Amira completed the sentence for him, with an amused glint in her eyes. Especially coming from someone like me. Robert had the decency to look embarrassed. I apologize, I didn't mean to offend. It's just that, well, it's very advanced work. Don't worry, Amira replied kindly. I'm used to that reaction. Actually, it's refreshing to talk to someone who understands the subject. The two delved into a technical conversation, speaking quietly about security algorithms and encryption protocols. Robert became increasingly impressed with Amira's knowledge and insight. Wheeler, who had lowered his magazine upon noticing the interaction, observed the scene with a mixture of confusion and irritation. He couldn't understand why someone like Robert, clearly a successful businessman, would be so interested in what that girl had to say. The contrast between Robert's respectful attitude and Wheeler's earlier behavior did not go unnoticed by the other passengers. Slowly, the atmosphere in the cabin began to change. People who had previously avoided looking at Amira now cast curious glances in her direction, intrigued by the animated conversation she was having with the respectable executive. As the night progressed, the first-class cabin of the plane entered a state of relative calm. Most passengers had settled in to sleep or watch movies on their individual entertainment systems. Wheeler, after several glasses of expensive wine, finally seemed to have calmed down, dozing in his seat with a sleep mask covering his eyes. Amira continued to work silently on her laptop, occasionally exchanging a few words in a low voice with Robert, who seemed increasingly fascinated by the young woman's project. The elderly lady who had defended Amira earlier observed the interaction with an approving smile. However, this tranquility was only superficial. As a harbinger of what was to come, small turbulences began to shake the plane. Most passengers barely noticed, accustomed to occasional oscillations during long flights. It was at this moment that the captain made an announcement over the aircraft's sound system. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are experiencing some light turbulence, but there's no cause for concern. As a precaution, we ask that everyone remain in their seats with their seat belts fastened. Thank you for your understanding. As passengers adjusted in their seats following the pilot's instructions, something unexpected happened. The screens of the entertainment systems flickered and then went completely black. A murmur of confusion ran through the cabin. Passengers touched their screens, trying to make them work again, without success. The loss of entertainment during a long flight was at the very least an irritating inconvenience. Wheeler, awakened by the commotion, removed his sleep mask and looked around, confused and irritated. "What the hell is going on?" he grumbled, trying to turn on his own screen without success. Amira, on the other hand, frowned, her fingers flying over her laptop keyboard with even more speed. Robert, observing her closely, noticed a concerned expression appearing on her face. "Something wrong?" he asked softly. Amira hesitated for a moment before responding. "I'm not sure, but this shouldn't be happening. Not with the new security protocols we implemented." Before Robert could ask more, the plane shook violently. This time it wasn't light turbulence. The jolt was strong enough to send loose items flying through the aisles and cause some passengers to cry out in surprise. The cabin lights flickered, momentarily plunging everyone into darkness before coming back on, now dimmer and unstable. "This..." Captain spoke again, his voice tense but controlled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some technical difficulties with our onboard systems. Please remain calm and in your seats. Our team is working to resolve the issue as quickly as possible." A tense silence fell over the cabin. Passengers exchanged apprehensive looks, some gripping their armrests tightly. Wheeler, his face pale, turned to Amira. For a moment all his previous arrogance had disappeared, replaced by pure fear. "I think, sir." "Do you know what's happening?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Amira looked at him, then at Robert, and finally at her laptop. Her expression was serious when she replied, "I think so, and it's not good." The stage was set for a twist that no one on board could have predicted. Not even the arrogant CEO who, until moments ago, believed he had everything under control. The flight was proceeding without major incidents, despite the palpable tension among the passengers. Suddenly, severe turbulence shook the aircraft, causing several items to fall from tables and overhead compartments. Passengers clutched their armrests, some letting out small cries of fright. Amira, who remained focused on her laptop, held it firmly to prevent it from slipping. She looked out the window, noticing the dark clouds now surrounding the plane. "The pilot's voice sounded over the speakers, asking everyone to remain in their seats and fasten their seatbelts. As the turbulence subsided, passengers began to notice that the entertainment screens in their seats had gone dark. Murmurs of dissatisfaction ran through the cabin. "What's happening?" a nervous passenger asked a passing flight attendant. "We're having some technical issues, ma'am. Please remain calm. Our team is working to resolve the situation," the attendant responded, trying to maintain a reassuring tone. James Wheeler, who until then had maintained an arrogant demeanor, began to show signs of concern. He repeatedly pressed the call button on his seat, demanding more information. Minutes later, the captain's tense voice sounded again over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the inconvenience. We are experiencing a technical problem with our onboard systems. The situation is under control, but we are having difficulties accessing some crucial data. If there are any systems experts among the passengers, please identify yourself to the crew." A tense silence fell over the cabin. Passengers looked at each other, some with expressions of fear, others with curiosity. James Wheeler, seeing an opportunity to redeem his image, promptly stood up. "I'm the CEO of a technology company," he announced loudly. "I can take a look at the problem." The flight attendants exchanged quick glances before escorting Wheeler to the front of the plane. Amira observed the scene with interest but remained silent, her fingers continuing to dance over her laptop keyboard. 20 tense minutes passed. Passengers anxiously awaited news, while the crew circulated through the cabin trying to maintain calm. Finally, Wheeler returned to his seat, his face red with frustration and shame. "Couldn't solve the problem, Mr. Technology?" A nearby passenger taunted, his voice laden with sarcasm. Wheeler shot the man a furious look but didn't respond. It was evident that his attempt to help had failed miserably. The captain spoke again. "Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately the problem persists. If there's anyone else with experience in aviation systems or advanced programming, please inform us immediately." It was at this moment that Amira, who had been silently observing everything, finally raised her hand. The action drew surprised looks from everyone around, especially from Wheeler, who couldn't hide his disdain. A flight attendant approached Amira, initially with skepticism. "Yes, miss." "Do you have experience with aviation systems?" Amira nodded calmly. "Yes, I do. In fact, I'm the lead developer of the new security system implemented on this aircraft." The flight attendant's eyes widened, sudden recognition crossing his face. "Wait a moment. Are you Amira Khalid?" The mention of the name caused a buzz among nearby passengers. Wheeler, who was about to make a derogatory comment, froze with his mouth half open. "Yes, that's me," Amira politely confirmed. "I've just returned from a global presentation on cybersecurity in aviation systems. I can take a look at the problem, if you'll allow me." The attendant quickly escorted her to the cockpit, leaving behind a group of stunned passengers and a visibly shaken James Wheeler. In the cockpit, Amira was greeted with respect and relief by the crew. She immediately set to work, her fingers flying over the keyboards while her eyes rapidly scanned the data screens. "The problem is in a code sequence that was corrupted during the system update," she calmly explained. "I can fix this manually, but it will take a few minutes." The captain and officers watched silently, impressed by the young woman's skill and confidence. In less than 15 minutes, Amira had identified and corrected the error, restoring all of the plane's systems to normal. "Incredible," the captain murmured. "Ms. Khalid, you've just saved this flight from a potential disaster. We can't thank you enough." Amira smiled modestly. "It's my job, Captain. I'm happy to help." When Amira returned to the passenger cabin, she was greeted with spontaneous applause. The passengers, now aware of who she was and what she had done, clapped enthusiastically. Many stood up from their seats to congratulate her personally. The elderly lady who had tried to defend her earlier approached with tears in her eyes. "My dear, you are an inspiration. Never let anyone diminish your worth." Meanwhile, James Wheeler shrank in his seat, his face a mask of shame and regret. He watched, stunned, as passengers took photos with Amira and shared articles about her. On their smartphones. "Did you know she turned down million-dollar offers from big tech companies to dedicate herself to humanitarian projects?" a passenger commented loudly. Wheeler felt as if each word was a stab to his inflated ego. He vaguely remembered a meeting at his company where they discussed a young prodigy they had unsuccessfully tried to hire. He never imagined that same young woman would be sitting next to him on a flight, wearing a modest hijab, and carrying more knowledge and integrity than he had ever possessed. As the flight neared its destination, Wheeler gathered the courage to approach Amira. "Ms. Khalid," he began, stuttering slightly, I'd like to apologize for my earlier behavior. It was unforgivable." Amira looked at him with a mixture of compassion and firmness. "Mr. Wheeler, I hope this incident serves as a lesson to you. Never judge someone by their appearance or age. A person's true value lies in their actions and character." Wheeler nodded, humbled, as he returned to his seat. The lesson had been painful, but necessary. When the plane finally landed in Los Angeles, passengers disembarked with a new perspective. Many stopped to thank Amira once again, some even asking for autographs. The story of what happened on the flight soon spread, first on social media and then in traditional media. James Wheeler, confronted with the negative repercussions of his actions, was forced to resign as CEO, while his company faced a significant drop in market value. Amira, on the other hand, used the unexpected attention to launch a diversity program in the technology industry, encouraging young people from all backgrounds to pursue careers in STEM. Months later, in a busy New York cafe, Wheeler was seen working as a barista, a much more humble position than his former CEO role. He served customers with a new attitude, kinder and more respectful. Meanwhile, on a television screen in the same cafe, Amira appeared being honored for her work in cybersecurity and digital inclusion. Her serene smile and elegant hijab were a powerful reminder that true greatness comes not from appearance or position, but from a person's character and actions. The lesson that began on that flight continued to echo, reminding everyone that respect, compassion, and knowledge are the true measures of an individual's worth.